Whereas in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the focus is on the sin and results of sin as man cultivates the cursing that God has to bring because of man's sin. The second half of Genesis is going to focus on the blessing that God desires to bring because of his grace. So in both cases, we have both elements. So in the first half, we certainly have hope, and in the second half, we certainly have the effects of sin and judgment and all those things. But still, the focus now has largely shifted to the ability of God to bring blessing even through weak vessels. And so this family that we call Israel is going to be highlighted, and all of their weaknesses are going to show clearly, and yet God is going to be at work to bring about his purpose, his blessing. By way of review, let me tie these narratives together, starting here with the Abraham stories and going through each of these three sets of patriarchal narratives. We've already looked at the Abraham stories, and we've seen that they're structured in a way that highlights the Abrahamic covenant and God's promises of land, seed, and blessing, that he is ultimately going to, through the descendants of Abraham, bring blessing to all the families of the earth. We saw the climax at the end as Abram shows his faith as he offers up Isaac on the altar. And these Abram stories are clearly showing God at work. The Abram stories are structured, however, in very similar ways to the rest of the stories. We have really three sets of patriarchal narratives. We have the Abram stories. We have the Jacob stories, which begin with this is what happened to Isaac, but the stories are mostly about Jacob. And then we have what are sometimes called the Joseph stories, or the stories of the brothers, because it's not just Joseph there. So we'll call them the stories of the brothers. But all three of these sets of narratives are set apart with a short genealogy in between of the minor characters of Ishmael and Esau. Those show the fulfillment of God's promises to these as well, but the focus is clearly on the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how God is going to ultimately accomplish his purpose. In the Jacob stories, we have a similar set of framing narratives that begin with an oracle, again a word from God as we had with Abram, and we have at the end that oracle fulfilled, again very similar to what we had with Abram. And these focus around the working of God in the life of Jacob at Haran, where it is clearly understood that it is God who is giving the blessing of children and of flocks. What these stories are going to tell us is the working of God in the life of Jacob to bring him to the point where he can be the blessing that God wants him to be. Because certainly as we begin the narratives, he is not a blessing. In fact, Jacob even today stands for a deceiver or something like that, a thief. And yet that probably isn't what his name originally meant. His mom probably didn't say, oh, what a cute little thief I've just had, but it was probably something that sounded like. Anyway, what we see in the Jacob stories is really the working of God in the life of Jacob. And of course, initially, he tries to steal the birthright. He tries to get what is promised to him in his own ways, and he will suffer the consequences for that, as will his parents. But he has to run, and God is going to work anyway. God is going to work in his life. As he leaves the land in chapter 28, God gives him his blessing and the Abrahamic covenant promises. When he gets to Laban, Jacob runs into someone that probably is even trickier than he is. So Uncle Laban would take advantage of him, except that God is on his side. And so God works even through the deception of Jacob and the attempted deceptions of Laban to bless Jacob and to show Jacob that God is at work. So that in the middle, in those chapters 29 and 30, Jacob recognizes that it was God who was the one who actually has done this for him. But then, of course, he hasn't changed, at least not too much. As he runs, he tries to deceive Laban and get away. God has to intervene, and God does. God intervenes in the life of Laban to make sure he doesn't destroy Jacob. God intervenes in Jacob's life by bringing about a wrestling match with an angel in which Jacob finally learns that he has to cling and not fight. God intervenes in the life of Esau, and God works so that Esau brings blessing instead of cursing, and he tries, instead of rather trying to kill him, he accepts him. And God intervenes in the Shechemites, where they destroy Shechem, and yet God keeps them from being destroyed. Ultimately, what God is doing is he's working in the life of Jacob to bring him to a place where he will finally bow before God. Even though in the wrestling match he changes his name to Israel and he clings to an extent, it's not until he gets back to Bethel to fulfill his vow that he made in chapter 28, where he finally puts away the household idols, or he finally bows before God and accepts God as his God. And so we have a significant movement in the narrative as God is at work in Jacob's life. In Genesis 37 to 50, we see God at work in the life of the brothers, the sons, the descendants of Jacob. And of course, the focus is largely upon Joseph, but not completely. There's also significant focus upon Judah, and that's significant because Judah is the one to whom God is going to give the promise of a king. Joseph is the one that Jacob is going to give the double portion, the firstborn, and his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are going to get equal rights as tribes with the other tribes because of that. But Judah is the one that will have the promise of royalty, the promise of a king coming through him. This set of stories is also framing, and it begins with a dream and it ends with that dream fulfilled, much like the others have been. There's many parallels between these sets of stories. But the focus in this story is around the testing in the center and around the sons of Jacob, Joseph testing the brothers, and Judah recognizing and revealing this change of character in his life. At the end of the book, at the end of the Joseph stories, or the brothers' stories, we see what really ties together not only the Joseph stories, but really the whole book as well. So when the brothers recognize that Jacob is dead and they're in really deep trouble because Joseph now has opportunity to kill them without Jacob ever knowing it, they come to him and they ask that he remember his father's request that he not kill them. Of course, Joseph's response is classic. Verse 19, Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I'll provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph shows that supernatural forgiveness when no one else would know. Of course, we have seen that already, and we recognize that when the brothers showed up in Egypt, but they perhaps didn't understand it yet. But he also shows that God has fulfilled his promise. God has fulfilled his promise to Joseph. God has shown that Joseph is now the benefactor and he can give blessing, which is the context in which the nation of Israel needs to be as well. But finally, we have seen that God is sovereignly at work to fulfill his plan, his purposes. So what he had established, what he had desired to do, is now finally accomplished. I'd like to actually take this all the way back to the beginning. In Genesis 1, we see God who is bringing good out of darkness, out of desolation, and we see that God is the only one who can do that. Again, at the end of the story, God brings good, and he brings good out of the darkness and desolation of brothers selling their brother into slavery, thinking that he would be killed. We see God bringing good out of evil itself. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is the kind of God that Israel needs to understand they are serving. The God who created the universe is the God who can bring good out of darkness and desolation, which they certainly had in the land of Egypt, and they would certainly have many times in the future. He's also the one who works in the lives of individuals to bring good out of whatever difficulty, darkness, or desolate situation they find themselves in. So the book of Genesis then really shows the working of God from beginning to end to accomplish his purpose, and ultimately that purpose now is redemption of mankind. It is to bring blessing to all the families of the earth, which he will do even in spite of the character flaws, the challenges, the sin of those that he chooses, and God will work in those lives to draw them to a place where he can use them for his glory and for his purposes. Israel needs to see that. We need to see that.